Hi! Today we are going to talk about how to do increasing and decreasing brick stitch. Alright, so the first thing that you're going to do here is you're going to pick up 2 cubes or whatever beads that you choose. I chose cubes for this recording since they fit really well together. So you're going to pull them down to the end of your thread, leaving 3 or 4 inches of tail. Then stitch through both of those beads in the same direction. So you're going to make a circle with your thread like I did here. Then what you're going to do is you're going to stitch in the same direction through just the first one. And you're going to pull tight. So what should happen when you pull tight is the beads should sit snug together with the holes parallel. Then what you're going to do is you're going to stitch down or through the other cube, so the second cube. So I usually take this opportunity to tie a knot with the thread and the tail. You don't have to tie a knot here, but if you choose not to, just remember when you finish the project to go back and make sure that you secure the end with the tail. So now what I'm doing is I'm stitching through that second cube, and what we're going to do is we're going to build the base of the brick stitch. And the way you do that is, you see, I'm going to pick up another cube and I'm going to make a circle with my thread and stitch through the cube that I'm exiting in the same direction, and I'm pulling it snug. Do you see how all 3 holes line up parallel here? That's what you want to do. So now I'm stitching back down into that cube I just added, and I'm going to pick up another cube and I'm going to make the circle with the thread again, and I'm going to stitch in the same direction, like I said, making a circle with the thread and pulling tight, so that the holes are sitting parallel. So for the purposes of this video, I'm going to make my base 4 cubes wide. So now I'm stitching up through that cube so we can start with the brick stitch. Once your thread is exiting the last bead of your brick stitch base, what you're going to do for increasing brick stitch is you're going to pick up 2 cubes or 2 beads. And then you're going to stitch through the thread. You're going to stitch under the thread that connects the last 2 beads. So you're going to slip it right into that hook right there, and you're going to pull tight. You're going to make sure that the cubes are the holes of the cubes are lined up parallel, and then what you're going to do is you're going to stitch back up the second cube that you added, like I am doing right here, and I'm just pulling the thread. Once you pull it nice and tight, the holes should be parallel, and you're going to pick up another cube, but just one this time, and you're going to stitch under the thread that connects the middle 2 beads right there. You see how I'm stitching under the thread that connects them, and I'm just hooking it there. And then I'm going to stitch back up the cube I just added, and I'm pulling it tight. So now the holes should be all lined parallel. So what I'm going to do here, and this is how you end the line of increasing brick stitch. So what you're going to do is once again, you're going to pick up 1 bead and you're going to stitch under the thread that connects the last 2 of the first base of the brick stitch, and you're going to stitch back up it. But so see how I'm not making it super tight yet? That's because we need to get back under that thread that connects the last 2. So what you're doing is you're going to pick up another cube and you're going to stitch under that thread that connects the last 2 cubes again and stitch back up that last cube like I'm doing here, and then pull tight. So the key here is you're adding 2 cubes under the same gap, and you're going to pull tight, and this might take a little finessing, but you can do it, and all the holes should be lined up parallel. So now we're doing this again. So now we're going to add our 3rd layer of increasing brick stitch. So since this is the beginning stitch, you're going to add 2 cubes, and you're going to stitch under the thread that connects the last 2 of the second layer of brick stitch, and you're going to stitch up the second bead that you added. So sometimes people find that that first cube that you added ends up being a little wonky, just kind of wiggly and not super secure. So what you can do to fix that is you can stitch down that bead, the first bead, and just right back up that second bead. And you can pull tight, and you've basically made a circle around your beads just to secure them a little bit. Then you're going to go adding your third layer of brick stitch the way you did it in the previous step. Very easy. Just adding a single bead at a time by stitching under the thread that connects the two cubes that you're adding your newest cube atop of, and you're going down the line. So now I am just finishing this layer of increasing brick stitch. So the reason it's called increasing is because with each layer, you're adding another bead. So my first layer had 4 beads, my second had 5, and now this layer will have 6. So as you see, I'm adding the bead there, but I'm not pulling it super tight since this is the last little thread gap we have. That means it needs room for 2 cubes. So now that I've added the very last cube, I'm gonna stitch back up it, and I'm gonna pull tight. Like I said, sometimes this takes a little finessing since the first one wasn't pulled tight. But now that that's all settled, this is our last increasing brick stitch that we're going to do today. Now we're going to talk about decreasing brick stitch. So decreasing brick stitch is very similar, except now instead of adding another bead, we're going to decrease a bead. So it's you start the same way. You pick up 2 cubes. However, you're not going to stitch under the first thread gap. You're going to stitch under the second one, as I'm pointing out here. You're skipping that first one, and you're going to stitch back up the cube. You're going to stitch down the first cube you added, and then back up the second cube. So you're making a circle with the thread just to secure the bead so it doesn't look, to secure the first bead, and you're anchoring it to the second just so it doesn't look wonky. Then what you're doing is you're continuing your brick stitch by adding 1 bead and stitching under the gap thread there, pulling tight, adding another bead, stitching under the thread gap, stitching back through that bead there, yeah, and now adding your last bead. Unlike with increasing brick stitch, when you end your decreasing brick stitch layer, you just add 1 bead under that thread gap. So, oh, I got a little knot. I'm going to pull it out. Now I'm stitching back up that last bead. So you see how this layer has 5 cubes instead of 6. So that's what we mean by decreasing brick stitch. Again, adding 2. Oh, I've just got 1 on. So now I'm stitching back out. So I can put 2 on because you need 2. So 2, skipping the first gap, skipping that first gap there. We don't want to stitch there. We want to stitch into the second one. Yep. And I'm going to stitch up the second cube added, down the first cube added, and then back up the second one and making a circle with the thread to secure that first cube is anchored really nicely to that second cube. And pulling it nice and tight. So once again, picking up 1 bead, stitching through under that thread gap, pulling it down, stitching back up the cube you just added. And since this is decreasing brick stitch, you just need to add 1 cube under that last thread gap. And stitch back up it. So this was increasing and decreasing brick stitch. Very cool. So now that I've pulled tight, I'm going to talk about how to finish these off. So we've already made a knot with that tail, as you recall, but now we got to tie off this thread. So what I've done is I've made a circle in the beads to make sure that when I'm tying my half hitch knot like I'm doing here, it has a few threads to secure itself on. So the way you do a half hitch knot is you stitch into the thread gap, you make a little loop with the thread, and then you stitch through that loop twice. So you don't have to do it twice. I prefer to do it twice. It's just a half, that's a half hitch knot. You pull it really nice and tight. And then what I'm going to do now is I'm going to burn the threads off. You don't have to burn the thread off. Cutting them will do just as well. I prefer to use a thread burner because what it'll do is it'll cauterize the knot instead of just cutting the threads off. So it's just a little bit more secure. And this, again, was increasing and decreasing brick stitch. So make sure to like and subscribe to the Buffalo Bead Gallery for more beading tutorials.